With the War of 1812 concluded, the Treaty of Ghent signed, Louisiana now begins to settle in somewhat as a member of the United States. So we'll see the cultural development of Louisiana, and then Catholicism under the American flag, followed by Protestantism in Louisiana, and then the pastimes of Louisiana. And then we'll look politically. We'll see Jacksonian Louisiana under the administration, or the rule, some would say, of Andrew Jackson, and the opposition to Jackson, which is the Whig Party and Whig Louisiana. The period from 1815 until 1860 is called the antebellum period. Antebellum, Latin for prior to the war. Of course, in 1860-61, you had the beginning of the Civil War. Here you see the growth of slavery in Louisiana and the growth of wealth in Louisiana, but it is a wealth that is not spread out throughout Louisiana. It's a concentrated wealth. It's a time of underdevelopment in Louisiana, where education was generally poor. There was poor facilities and infrastructure. See how the wealth is not being used. Organized religion in Louisiana was in a generally poor state. In looking at Catholicism under the American flag, one must understand that the United States was largely a Protestant nation. And it was a Protestant nation that had a very healthy fear of Catholicism, which was termed papism. And here is Louisiana, largely a Catholic state. And so Louisiana Catholics called the period after the purchase the Dark Days. It was a lax morality in the state, a scarcity of priests, widespread indifference to religion. There was a huge fight between Father Patrick Walsh and Père Antoine. There was a sudden withdrawal of funding for the clergy, for after all, Congress shall not respect the establishment of any religion. And so there was no more funding for the clergy from the state. There was uncertainty over American recognition of church property rights. 16 of the 22 Ursuline nuns departed for Europe. Half the Spanish clergy also left for Spain. Louisiana belonged to a diocese with Missouri and St. Louis as its episcopal see. Bishop Joseph Rosati treated New Orleans and Louisiana with disdain and contempt. New Orleans and Louisiana would not be given its own bishop under the American flag until 1829. When the bishop did come, he was Leo Denecker, who was only 30 years old at the time of his appointment. He was a member of the Congregation of the Mission. We call them in New Orleans today the Vincentians, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, not to be confused with the St. Vincent de Paul Society that you might find in certain Catholic churches. These are an order of priests dedicated to St. Vincent de Paul. There was a new wave of Ursuline nuns that came in, and also a group called the Religious of the Sacred Heart. It gave a clerical infusion. Denecker also helped establish the second major parish in New Orleans. In 1833, he established St. Patrick's, which became known after a while as the other cathedral of New Orleans. And it is literally on the same street as the St. Louis Cathedral. Camp and Charter Street changed names when they crossed Canal Street, and both churches are 7 blocks from Canal Street. This St. Patrick's Church ministered to the growing Irish Catholic population, who desired a church that did not feature French as its main language. Now you'd say, well, wait, wasn't the Mass in Latin back then? Yes, it was. But the sermons and the lingua franca was French. In 1803, there was only the Ursuline-run school for a Catholic educational institution. The next school was established by Martha Fortier and was for free women of color. Now, the Religious of the Sacred Heart then opened schools in Grand Coteau, Louisiana, which is just to the north and east of Lafayette, and Convent, Louisiana, which is along the river near where the Sunshine Bridge is located. The Daughters of Charity opened an orphanage called the Poydras Asylum, but it was the arrival of immigrants between 1820 and 1845 that solidified the Catholic faith. First of these came from Saint-Domingue, Haiti, who strengthened the French presence and provided a balance for the French against the growing Irish and German influx. But it was the Irish and the Germans that really were the bulk of the immigration to Louisiana. These Irish and German were mostly Catholic. They established their own communities and called for their own parishes, seeing that St. Louis and St. Patrick were for an upper class of people, and they said, we're not that class of people, we want something for our own. The man who followed de Necker as bishop was called Louisiana's Joshua. He was named Antoine Blanc, and he was described by a Louisiana historian as a man of vision, humble piety, sound administrative judgment, determination, courage, blunt firmness, gentlemanly courtesy, tenacity, and a gospel-based respect for others. And in addition to that, he was a pretty nice guy. He served as Bishop of Louisiana and Mississippi from 1835 until 1860. And he faced numerous problems during his episcopacy, which ended just before the Civil War. He had a huge geographic diocese with very few priests. He had no seminary to train future priests. He had no diocesan income. There was widespread disdain for the church. It was allowed to exist, but not many people attended Mass or anything. You also had a widespread persecution of the church from nativists, who called themselves the Know-Nothings. Nativists were people that said that they had been on American soil long enough to be considered true Americans, and that these new immigrants coming in were not truly American. They were papists. They were beholden to a foreign religious ruler, the Pope. They didn't even worship the same God that Protestants did. Yes, sounds familiar to today, doesn't it? He also had frequent outbursts of yellow fever, a growing immigrant population, increased definition of social strata against blacks. But he did, during his tenure, become the first Archbishop of New Orleans. So New Orleans went from being a diocese to an archdiocese, which means a leader diocese or a leading diocese. One of Blanc's major problems was the established ruling order in the Diocese of New Orleans. They called themselves the trustees of the St. Louis Cathedral, the old Marguliers. They attempted to nullify Blanc's appointment of a rector for the cathedral. You see here a struggle between the clergy and the laity. Blanc condemned the action as schismatic. That meant that they were going against church doctrine, and he sued in civil court. It went all the way to the state Supreme Court, who found in favor of Blanc and allowed the Archbishop to affirm his authority. And in doing so, it allowed Blanc to establish more parishes in the city and in the Archdiocese. In 1838, he allowed the Vincentians to open up a seminary. In 1837, the Jesuits, who had been thrown out of most of the European regions and their colonies because of perceived revolutionary activity, were now allowed to return to Louisiana, and they established St. Charles College in Grand Coteau. In 1847, on the corner of Common and Baronne Streets, they established the College of the Immaculate Conception. This eventually split off, for Loyola University moved off of that campus to its uptown location in 1911. 15 years later, the college closed its doors on Common and Baronne and moved to the corner of Carrollton and Banks, where it's known today as Jesuit High School. Another religious order that came into town around the time that the Irish and the German immigrants were arriving was the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, better known as the Redemptorists. They immediately began to establish churches for both the Irish, German, and the French congregations in what was known as the Irish Channel of New Orleans, or what others would start calling Uptown, others would call the Lower Garden District, but it really is the Irish Channel. Down on the corner of Constance and St. Andrew and Josephine, and bracketed by Magazine Street and Annunciation Streets, is what is known as the Ecclesiastical Square, or the Ecclesiastical Circle. There, 3 churches were built by the Redemptorists. In the upper left-hand corner was St. Alphonsus, as you see its interior below. That was the church built for the Irish congregation. The beautiful Baroque spire and the Baroque interior in the center is that of St. Mary's Assumption Church. Now, St. Alphonsus closed in 1975, and it is used as a museum. But St. Mary's, which is right across the street from St. Alphonsus, is still being used today as a parish. There was a third church 1 block away on the corner of Jackson and Constance Streets. This was Notre Dame de Bon Secours, and this, of course, was for the French community. That church burned down in the early 1900s, and there is only a vacant lot left to this day. With the Redemptorists and the Jesuits came an infusion of religious orders to Louisiana. The Marianites of Holy Cross came in 1848, establishing eventually Holy Cross College, now the University of Holy Cross across the river. The Holy Cross Brothers, who established Holy Cross School in the lower 9th Ward, now out in Gentilly. The School Sisters of Notre Dame. The Sisters of St. Joseph, who had the big property on Mirabeau Avenue in the center of town that they're now turning into a water park of some sort. The Sisters of the Good Shepherd. The Dominican Sisters from Cabra Island came in 1860. They formed Dominican College and St. Mary's Dominican High School. And the lady you see in the upper right-hand corner is Henriette DeLille. She was a free woman of color. If you notice by looking at her, though, she was very, very white-looking. She established a confraternity of women who tended to the needs of the elderly and the uneducated, and she formed her own religious order, homegrown religious order in New Orleans of black nuns. They're called the Sisters of the Holy Family. They're the first native Louisianians Henriette DeLille is the first native Louisianian under consideration for canonization. And the Sisters of the Holy Family run St. Mary's Academy out on Chef Mentor and the LaFon nursing homes. And on a personal note, they took care of my grandfather before he passed away. Catholic education prior to the Civil War was growing but still substandard. Nuns, for instance, were not allowed to teach boys until 1888, and most of the schools in Louisiana were for the poor and orphans. The rich took care of their own education. The Catholic Indigent Orphan Asylum was founded for African Americans, and the first provincial council of the Archdiocese urged the establishment of parochial schools. With the church came charity. And charity in Louisiana was a very, very sophisticated and deep-running organization. The Daughters of Charity, they ministered to many of the city's poor. The St. Vincent de Paul Society was a charitable organization established in New Orleans in 1852. Its members had to swear secrecy because they believed that charity was best given when no one was looking. By 1860, Catholics in Louisiana now had more than 100 parishes and almost 50 schools in which to educate their children. There was, of course, resistance to the church because it was Catholic. The Know-Nothings, as I've already mentioned, they call themselves the American Party. They were anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. They were strongest in the North in cities like New York and Philadelphia, but there was also some influence in the South. Anti-Catholic literature flooded New Orleans. Many warned not to elect Catholic citizens to office. There was some mob violence, such as the New Orleans riot of 1858, in which Protestants actually occupied the Cabildo for a time until they were negotiated out. But the Know-Nothing Party waned in the mid-1850s, and the remnants of its membership gravitated over toward a new party that formed in the 1850s, the Republican Party. Well, we have covered a great deal of Catholicism. What about Protestantism? Now, there were religious restrictions on Protestant immigrants during the early colonial period, being as Louisiana was under the French and Spanish crowns, which were ardently Catholic. But there were some Protestants that came in. Some of these were called Huguenots. These were the French Calvinists. One of the best books that will tell you all about the Huguenots was The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. In the 1730s and the 1740s, there was this religious revival movement called the Great Awakening that really put a jump charge into American Protestant religion to give it a sort of a charismatic bent, the revival tent style of things. And in many ways, it was the forerunner of the American Revolution as well. But the first Protestant church was established in Louisiana in 1803, Christ Church Episcopal, which became known as Christ Church Cathedral. The first Protestant clergyman was Philander Chase, and the first Protestant service was held in 1805 at the Cabildo. Presbyterians came later. In 1818, the First Presbyterian Church of Louisiana, under the leadership of Reverend Sylvester Larned, held services. And you also had Methodist circuit writers who conducted revivalist style of meetings. Elisha Bowman was a Methodist preacher who journeyed to Louisiana in 1806. The Methodist Society started in Opelousas, Louisiana. And there were Methodist chapels throughout Louisiana. Axley Chapel, Plaquemine Brûlé, New Orleans had one, and Boeuf Prairie. Remember that the Methodism is the great middle-class religion of Protestantism. What about the pastimes of Louisiana? There was a great deal of sport and recreation. Louisiana became known as a sportsman's paradise because of its hunting and fishing. The arts, especially dance, the fade dodo among the Acadians, where they brought their entire family. And then when the children got sleepy and it was late in the evening and people wanted to dance, they'd bring the children into another room and they'd say to them, go dodo. They had several theaters throughout Louisiana, especially in New Orleans, for stage productions. But politics was really the pastime of Louisiana, and it was a reflection of the dislike between the Anglo-Saxons and the Creoles. In 1824, the tacit agreement of alternating the governorship between the Creoles and the Anglo-Saxons came to an end. In 1816, Jacques Villeray became governor. He was succeeded by Thomas Robertson in 1820. In 1824, Henry Thibodeau took over briefly because Robertson died, and so in 1824, Henry Johnson was selected over the Creole candidate. Even though Henry Thibodeau was just briefly the governor, the Anglos said, well, that counts as a term. And so the Creoles said, fine, every man for himself. The late 1820s and 1830s was the time in which Andrew Jackson was president of the United States. Now, let's talk about Jacksonian Louisiana. First of all, in 1824, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay were 3 of 4 candidates for the office of President of the United States. Well, none of the men had an electoral majority, and so the vote went into the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay engineered the vote in favor of the second-place finisher, John Quincy Adams. The next day, John Quincy Adams named Henry Clay as Secretary of State, to which many of the Jackson people cried foul and said, this is a corrupt bargain. This brought to an end the era of good feelings, which was the period after the War of 1812, in which U.S.-Britain relations warmed, and there were no real big partisan politics because there was only one political party. And now there would be more political parties. Louisiana itself was divided into pro- and anti-Jackson factions. During this time, Pierre d'Aubigny became the first and only foreign French to hold the governorship. That is, he was born in France. He died in office through a carriage accident. Then André Roman was elected governor after him, and this threw off the governor's election to an odd year. The Roman administration saw the addition of numerous parishes. He presided over the growing two-party system between the Whigs and the Democrats. And he saw an economic boom in Louisiana in the 1830s. Part of the boom was because of the market revolution. Now, again, this is something for a U.S. history class, but it has something to do, of course, with Louisiana as an American state. What was the market revolution? In short, it was a period in which improvements in transportation and communication through canals and railroads and the telegraph took place. You had an increase in industrialization because of the invention of interchangeable parts, devices like the cotton gin, the steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's reaper. You had a revival of mercantilism, protected markets through tariffs. We've been hearing a great deal about tariffs in the news lately, haven't we? It was a triumph of capitalism over democracy. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that Americans now saw capitalism as being the primary focus of the nation, rather than in individual liberties. That liberty could be found through the acquisition of capital, rather than through the acquisition of land. Now, what are the effects on Louisiana? Well, first of all, cotton. During this time, the cotton gin had made short staple cotton very profitable, and therefore cotton was bringing in a great deal of wealth to Louisiana. And you also saw the digging of a canal, the New Basin Canal. If you go out to the big giant neutral ground between West End and Pontchartrain Boulevards here in the city of New Orleans, you will note that no houses are built on that. And one of the reasons being is that for a long time the ground was not able to support housing because that was a canal. And the canal went all the way from where Russell's Marina Grill is. There's actually still the old pumping station for the lock is still there. It would take you all the way down using the Pontchartrain Expressway, that's the bed of the canal, to the back of the Superdome where there was a turning basin. And this canal was built in part to give Irish and other immigrants access to the economic resources of the city and to take their goods in and out of the city from the middle of town to Lake Pontchartrain. In Louisiana, you had Jacksonian democracy. Jackson created the Democratic Party along with his followers in 1828. The Democratic platform was pro-executive. That meant the president is primary, and the legislature, the Congress, is not nearly as prominent. In fact, we're almost against it. There was a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They were against the national bank. They were for white male suffrage, no matter what property they may hold. They were heavy on the patronage system, that is, giving offices to friends and supporters. And they were in favor of territorial expansion, manifest destiny. They believed that the United States should go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was manifest destiny, because that meant civilization would carry on. In Louisiana, the Democratic Party was strong in the cities and in the poorer urban areas. It was strong among immigrants, especially the Irish and the Germans. They tended to tack more toward the Democratic Party. One of the most notable Democrats in Louisiana was John P. Slidell, who married a Creole and crossed party lines to befriend another Louisianian named Judah P. Benjamin, a Whig. Benjamin would later serve as Secretary of the Treasury to the Confederate States of America. Slidell managed to engineer the vote in Louisiana and in other states for James K. Polk in 1844. The map you see here is that of the city of New Orleans, showing in the center, moving almost to the dead center of the crescent, the line of the New Basin Canal, and to the right of it is Bayou St. John. This is the entrance to the New Basin Canal on Lake Pontchartrain as it approaches the lock. On the right, you see a drawbridge crossing the New Basin Canal. This is around the intersection now of City Park Avenue and the I-10. Here you see the New Basin Canal going toward what is now around Xavier University. And here you see a streetcar crossing on Carrollton Avenue. That's the Carrollton interchange today, but at the time there was a drawbridge across the New Basin Canal. In the 1950s and 60s, the New Basin Canal was filled in with shells, and it was converted into an expressway that became part of I-10. If you see the lower right-hand corner, you notice the baseball field. That is old Pelican Stadium. Right across the street from that would be where the site of Pelican Stadium is now where that large old hotel stands, which is now a storage facility. And across the street is where you would have found Rock and Bowl at one time. And the red line shows Bayou St. John as it was accessed by the French. And then Bayou St. John had a little connection to a canal called the Old Basin. Now in the blue, you see the path of the New Basin Canal. And if you see at the bottom terminus of the New Basin Canal, you can see the outline of the Superdome. And that's where the turning basin was, right around where the train station is. Now opposing the Democrats was the Whig Party. The Whig Party was formed during a period of the Second Great Awakening in the upper northeast of the country. And it was one in which they were anti-Jackson. And therefore they were pro-legislative and anti-executive. They favored the National Bank. They favored a protective tariff. That tariff word again. There were extreme elements in the Whig Party that contained a streak of nativism that often became fanatical. Sometimes they became even violent. From this faction of the Whigs will come the Know-Nothings. Louisiana Whigs were very strong in the southern parishes and consisted mostly of wealthy planters and merchants. Some of the notable Whigs in American history: Henry Clay, the great compromiser, joined the Whigs. Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, Old Tippecanoe, the 9th U.S. President. John Tyler, the 10th U.S. President, who succeeded Harrison when Harrison died only 31 days into his presidency. Zachary Taylor, the only president from the state of Louisiana, the 12th U.S. President, and Abraham Lincoln was a Whig when he began. In Louisiana, the most notable Whig was Edward Douglass White, Sr.